So this episode will explore John the Baptist's time in the wilderness, and I think one of the ideal pictures to discuss this is Giovanni di Paolo's young John the Baptist. It's one of my favourite pictures of this scene. And you can see the young boy of a bit of an indeterminate age. He sort of looks like a pre-teen here, leaving the crenellated, fortified walls of a sort of Italian Renaissance city. And you can see he's just stepping out of that city gate into the wilderness. The young boy is actually represented twice. You see he's both at the lower left, and then up again we see him as he ventures into sort of quite scary looking hills.
Crazy shapes in the mountains, aren't there? It's interesting that the European imagination, desert simply meant empty space, but empty space in Europe isn't sandy desert as we might think of it. It's just where people don't live. And for that reason I find it especially interesting that, as you say, he's not just making one transition. I mean, he looks to me like little Dick Whittington with his knapsack over his shoulder.
Yes.
But doing the opposite of Dick Whittington, because he's not going off to the big city, he's quitting the big city and heading off into the countryside. But he isn't even going to be satisfied with the cultivated countryside. He really wants to go to where no one lives, and that's up in the mountains. And his second appearance is the second transition. Yes. Two sorts of boundaries across this journey.
It dramatises that distance, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I love how Giovanni di Paolo has represented this. He's created this sort of aerial perspective of the cultivated lands. So you can see the patches of green, much as you see that when you fly over them.
Yes.
Today, that's how you read the earth from above.
Oh, what a feat of imagination.
This is so clever. And then so he's left that cultivated lands, and as you say, he's winding his way up into these very kind of ominous looking rocks.
It's interesting you say he could be pre-teen, because some of the very early church fathers commenting on material that isn't in the Bible, imagining what John might have been doing, as it were, between the first part of his story when he's born and named, and then his appearance on the banks of the River Jordan. They imagined that almost as soon as he could walk, he headed off into the wilderness. And that was important in their minds because he had to be kept pure. That the task, the great task he would have of baptizing Christ required him to be pure, and the best place to stay pure is in the wilderness. So off he goes pretty much
in the city.
As soon as possible. Which means that he can't be reliant on any of the ordinary things, the comforts of life, that go with city life or even cultivated rural life. He's got to be radically reliant on God and on the things of wild nature.
So the youth of his, the youth that he's represented as, it sort of enhances this idea of his vulnerability and the need to sort of rely both on God and on his own self-sufficiency. And actually we have another painting in the National Gallery by an unknown Italian artist that sort of, it's the next step, and this is an artist imagining how John might have been self-sufficient in the wilderness. So I think we should have a look at that next.
Wonderful.
Follow me. Ben, I've brought you up here to conservation so we can have a closer look at a painting that's not currently on display. Now we're sort of skipping ahead 200 years in the history of art. So we moved from mid-15th century to mid-17th century. And we have here a representation by an Italian artist, we don't know who, of John the Baptist in the wilderness. And you see he's a little bit older than he was portrayed in the Giovanni di Paolo.
Teenager.
And I was suggesting that this painting might kind of allude to how the Baptist was self-sufficient in the wilderness. And I wanted to draw your attention to this ingenious little invention that he seems to have made.
There's a natural spring coming out of the rock, which he's channeled, hasn't he, using a reed, the same sort of material as his famous reed cross.
Yes, his attribute.
In a cleft in another reed. And extraordinarily, therefore sort of echoing their cruciform shape, a crossbar and an upright.
Yes.
And yet this cross channels to him the water of life, the water that he depends on.
Exactly.
That's theologically very rich, isn't it?
Very eloquent. The idea that the wilderness isn't just a place of absence, but actually it can provide.
Yeah.
Yes.
It reminds me too of Moses feeding the Israelites in the wilderness. As he led them through, there's a story of Moses striking the rock and water flowed out.
Yes, exactly.
So again, the provision by God in the wilderness of water is something that the Baptists, like Moses, again, a sort of tradition of Old Testament prophethood, that he channels.
And obviously water being so key to the figure of the Baptist, kind of anticipating the future baptisms that he will perform.
Yeah.
And sort of the next moment you wonder then what happens to the Baptist in the wilderness. And actually I've asked Conservation to display another picture that we own just beside here for us to have a look at. And this is Moretto from Brescia's painting from the early 1520s. And it's an extremely unusual iconography. You have a kneeling John the Baptist, a little older than we've seen him.
He's gone from boy to teenager now to
Yes,
young man.
Grown man. And he's kneeling quite humbly at the banks of the River Jordan, we can imagine, perhaps. And you actually have Christ in a gesture of blessing before him.
There's a very famous line in the Gospels about the relation between the two, Christ and John the Baptist, in which the Baptist says of Christ, he must increase and I must decrease. There's one who comes after me who is greater than I am, and he must increase and I must decrease. And the way they're related to each other physically expresses just that change
Perfectly.
in relationship. He's falling down onto his knees.
In humility.
Christ on slightly higher ground, raising his hand above him.
And there's something very interesting about this steep, rocky path. You almost imagine that after being blessed by Christ, the young Baptist might stand up and make his way back into the city.
To me, it looks almost like a moment of ordination, or at least commissioning, as if Christ is saying, now you're ready to go and begin your public ministry. So he's about to sort of go public, begin the preaching for which he's famous on the banks of the Jordan, and all the city of Jerusalem is going to discover him and come out to find out what he's got to say.
And we'll focus on the preaching in our next episode.